Hello. First of all, dear anthropologists, architects are also interested in people. And I'll try to prove that today. First of all, about the theme of the presentation, mutation. By that we understand one of the types of evolution where within the process of reproduction some information is not reflected precisely and it's replaced with another information, and in the result of that there is unexpected variation created. How I see or understand mutation as a process within the context of architecture, I start with an illustration of French Revolution. We all understand that it was a big revolution, that the turning point in the history of the world, that had a very strong enlightening background. However, we have to admit that intellectuals are not creating revolutions. They are maybe somehow directing them. But traditionally, revolutions are created from some financial materials, maybe with political factors. The big French Revolution was developed in the moment when there was a very critical financial downturn, and there was an intolerable poverty level reached, and at the end of 80s started the so-called salt mass riots. What were those salt riots? In France, there existed very complicated tax system, the so-called Gabelle system. However, the most critical was the so-called salt tax that existed already since early middle era. And the tax was increased very drastically. This decrease was created by ambitious project of Céline Royal by Louis XV. They tried to solve not only industrial problems, but also housing problems. They planned to place some 30,000 happy Frenchmen in that place. There would be schools, gardens, horse houses, and all the necessary infrastructure. At that time, France had no means available for that. That's why they increased the salt tax or saline tax. And thus the problem started and the revolution actually started. So, and that is what I said in the beginning, is that in the result of some unexpected mutations, there can be unexpected results. And now to the main theme of my presentation, and that is housing. I will try to look at different aspects, and when I looked at the housing program of United States for the last 80 years, I recognize that it is quite a challenge. So United States of America, 30s, and that is a moment when the world in general is at the top, sort of. Political and economical problems are solved. Europe and the United States are both facing dilemma. So how to move on, how to solve housing problem? Because we know that there were mass riots and revolutions in other countries as well. So Europe chooses this Corbusier or radiant city method. The United States initially chose a different way, which is defined in the project by Frank's rights, Bordaker City, and that is utopic understanding to divide all the land of America in 4 small acres, in small 4 quadrants, and to give this broad acre unit to one American, so he or she could live there, have everything what is necessary for living. Those small acres would be somehow combined. There would be roads constructed, then there would be helicopters later on, and the America would become like a carpet of suburbs or housings. It sounds quite utopical that such idea existed in cities. However, if the project was never implemented and it was not realistic, it turns out that Mr. Wright was quite right in this futuric context. If we look at America at that time, first of all, that is Big Depression. These are 2 iconic photographs you can see right now symbolizing that time. That is Big Depression in the 30s, the beginning of 30s, and then the Second World War, which definitely left consequences on all countries, including the United States of America, and in some way worsened the social provision and security of their inhabitants, and also material status. America had to solve a lot of problems, also economical problems, including housing problems. So consequently, there are 2 big plans in America in the middle of 30s, and that is the so-called New Deal plan, which is plan of Mr. Roosevelt, and then in 40s there is a plan of Harry Truman, this so-called Fair Deal. These plans were very wide and broad about recovering of economy, stimulating of entrepreneurship, including solving of the problems of housing. There are 3 big organizations created by that housing department and 2 sub-units, the task of which is to provide availability of financing to inhabitants of Americans in order for them to obtain their houses. And it is very important to pay attention to those names as such within this context. So first, New Deal. That is synonymic meaning to the legacy, actually, with all the consequences. And after the New Deal, there can be only Fair Deal. There are these 2 financial organizations which I mentioned, Fannie and Mae. They are very strong financial organizations, and they create a feeling of home for Americans. Due to those programs, the loans are available to Americans with very favorable conditions. The initial paying is 0.3%, and that is covered either by funds of the government or private funds. Payment term for the loan is 30 to 40 years. The only condition the American family had to fulfill, because the loan is given for household. The only condition to meet is to have at least 1 family member, so either husband or wife, employed in a sound work, which for Freddie or Fannie seems adequate. In this way, as citizens of America become, in a way, pledgers of those loans, but at the same time they are very happy at that moment because they get this possibility to buy for themselves their own house. What happens with cultural scenery of America? So this futuric idea of Mr. Right is implemented in a way. America becomes the carpet of suburb, which is connected with big roads. There are no pedestrian streets. Nevertheless, America slowly becomes like unlimited reservoir of housing. That could continue indefinitely, as it was already stipulated with this federal housing program, but it does not happen so. In the middle of 70s, we see rapid drop in the demand for housing, and that lasts even up till today. In each this loop of the chart, we can see some reflection of some global crisis, like 73, 75 energetic crisis, then 70s currency crisis, and so on. However, this tendency is obvious. The demand for housing is rapidly decreasing, and respectively also the supply is decreasing more than by 8 times, starting from 70s. If we now think about what happened during that time, then we have to understand those basic conditions existing at that moment when Americans got their loans. Of course, there were pros and cons. Americans had the possibility to get those loans, and that by itself was very important because, as I said, the very favorable conditions were for those loans. Repayment time was 30, 40 years, and that was the hope of the whole nation of America, that their life will be much better. If we look at the cons, they are absolutely the same as the pros. What was hope became hopeless because loan for 30, 40 years means that me or my neighbor who took that loan, I can't change anything in my household because within 30, 40 years I cannot move, I cannot change my working place, and finally I cannot get divorced. I cannot change my family, and that actually is very important social factor. That is private freedom factor, because when getting this loan for household, the personal liberty of American was very much limited. So Americans don't want to take those loans later on when realizing that. At the same time, there is a significant change in the structure of society of America. People are not getting married anymore, starting from 70s, as we see now in this chart. Again, this curve is quite dramatic. Of course, there are different factors participating as well, not only housing. But yes, also changes are in the understanding of the society. Then, if we look closer to nowadays, more and more people live with their parents. They don't want to obtain their own house because actually they don't need that because they are single. So why? And America has its typical problem, which finally in 21st century has come to Europe. America is conservative, and it's always better to live together with parents. And actually, new generation is created. We can call them grandchildren of hippies. If hippies were children of the first loan takers or borrowers, and we called them flower children, and they created communities and communes and run away from home. So the grandchildren of those hippie children are not already willing to live in those circumstances. That is some kind of frustration in the society. This is generation which is not getting married, which is living with parents or renting some small flat, and also having another peculiarities of those grandchildren of children of hippies. And when we look at the tendencies already in our century, then the demand for rent spaces is again dramatically increasing, and which is typical to America. That is, when there is a demand, there is also the supply. And probably we remember what was started a couple of years ago and completed last year. That was this initiative by Mr. Bloomberg. So vertically, that's Mr. Bloomberg. Horizontally, that's a small flat Mr. Bloomberg is looking at. And now we see that in all big American cities, zoning system is changed, construction rules are changed. This act on 1940 about housing permits to build small flats, 20 to 25 square meter size. And in practice, there is absolutely different typology developed. That is to satisfy the needs of and the demand of the grandchildren of the hippie. If we look at that from the point of view of 21st century, Japanese are calling it as a social disease. They call it hikikomori. These are the people which live a very closed life, which live in small cottages. In Japan, there were such people. So they live in small flats, and currently this problem is considered to be a phenomenon, and that is typical to big cities of America, the towns of America. There are those people having this hikikomori syndrome. They want the smallest possible space. They don't have to tend about. They don't want to be socially active. It may have the forms of latent illness, but it may have also clear social forms. If we now look at those small flats in which these people are living with this hikikomori syndrome or tendency to it, then it is very difficult to predict what is going to happen with this generation that is going to live in claustrophobic apartments or flats, and which is not willing to communicate with external world in the direct form, because the media available to us today allows us not to leave our flat forever. If we look now 80 years back to those two pictures I'm showing right now, this Frank Lloyd Wright broad acre city and this hikikomori small flat, I would ask two questions. One is, and that is to me actually, was it possible for Mr. Wright to imagine that his plan would end or have intermediate point in the reflection? No. The answer is no. And the next question is, America is asking itself whether in 30s, starting with this plan of Frank Lloyd and starting with this New Deal, whether there was not already embedded this hikikomori problem in the society. Because initially, as I said, there was hope for housing problems and solutions, and now you see the result. Thank you for your attention.